A waitress, drowning in the wreckage of a life she never chose, balanced a tray of crystal water glasses. The man she served wore a watch that could have erased her grandfather's medical debt and bought their house back from the bank, with enough left over for a new car. He was sketching on a high-resolution tablet, arguing over what looked like the skeleton of a new god rising into the sky, a skyscraper, and he was about to approve a change that would turn it into a tomb. She had a fraction of a second to make a choice. Remain a ghost in a black apron, unseen and unheard, or risk the only job standing between her and utter ruin by telling one of the most formidable builders in America that his legacy was about to be built on a fatal lie. That single terrifying decision to speak would not just change her life, it would detonate it, catapulting her from the quiet desperation of her world into a war fought in boardrooms and on construction sites, where the only foundation she could trust was the one she built for herself. The scent of seared steak and old money was the air Clara Evans breathed, but never tasted. It was a perfume that belonged to the patrons of the Gilded Steer, not the staff. At 24, she was a master of the silent orbit, circling tables laden with food she couldn't afford, her feet a dull, constant ache inside her sensible black shoes. Her life was a ledger of mounting losses, a full scholarship to Columbia's architecture program, abandoned, her grandfather's carpentry business, bankrupted, their small home in Queens, now plastered with a foreclosure notice that felt like a final, mocking verdict. Her grandfather, Arthur, was asleep in his small room above a laundromat, a place that always smelled of bleach and regret. A proud man who had once built houses with his bare hands was now being unbuilt by a disease that eroded his memories and a healthcare system that devoured his savings. Clara wasn't just scraping by, she was clinging to the edge of a cliff by her fingernails, and the rock was crumbling. That's when he came in. Alistair Finch didn't walk into a room, he annexed it. He was a man carved from granite and impatience, his presence sucking the ambient noise out of the space. His suit was a quiet declaration of power, dark and perfectly tailored. He was followed by a younger man, Marcus Thorne, whose suit was louder, trying to make a statement its wearer hadn't yet earned. They took the corner booth, the one with the best view of the city Alistair Finch had helped shape. Clara knew his face, not from magazines, but from the cornerstone plaques on half the buildings she sketched in her worn notebook during her subway commute. He built the world she dreamed of inhabiting. Marcus radiated the slick, unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence. "Scotch." "Neat," Finch grunted, his eyes already fixed on the tablet Marcus was sliding across the polished mahogany table. "And for you, sir?" Clara asked Marcus, her voice a practiced blend of politeness and invisibility. Marcus glanced up, his gaze sliding over her uniform with a flicker of dismissal. "The same, and a bottle of sparkling water for the table. San Pellegrino." Clara returned with the drinks on a heavy silver tray, her movements economical and precise. As she leaned in to place the glasses, her eyes were involuntarily drawn to the screen of the tablet. It wasn't just a sketch, it was a detailed structural schematic, a cross-section of a skyscraper's core. The words Finch Tower, Final Core Revision, were stamped at the top. She saw steel grades, load-bearing columns, concrete sheer walls. The rest of the restaurant ceased to exist. The clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, it all vanished. There was only the blueprint. And it was wrong, not just slightly off, but fundamentally, catastrophically flawed. She knew this because, in her other life, the one that ended the day Arthur collapsed on a job site, she hadn't just been an architecture student. She had been Arthur's prodigy. He hadn't taught her how to read blueprints. He'd taught her to see them as living things, to understand the flow of forces, the secret language of stress and tension. "A building breathes, Clara," he'd say, his calloused finger tracing a line on a plan. "And that's its spine. You make the spine weak, the whole thing comes down." The revision on the screen was a proposal to change the steel composition for the primary support columns on floors 40 through 60. A cost-saving measure, no doubt. They were swapping out grade 65 steel for grade 50 and compensating by marginally increasing the concrete reinforcement. It was a fatal trade-off. She could see the stress points as if they were glowing red. Under a high wind load or a minor seismic event, the columns wouldn't bend. They would buckle. Arthur's voice echoed in her head. "The spine is weak." They were building a giant with broken bones. Marcus was leaning in, his voice a confident purr. "As you can see, Uncle Alistair, the engineers at Volkov Construction signed off. It saves us nearly 12 million on materials, and their simulations show it's well within tolerance." Finch grunted, staring at the screen. He was about to sign his name to a monument that could one day become a mass grave, all based on a lie dressed up as a cost-saving measure. Clara stood frozen, the heavy tray suddenly feeling weightless. This was the chasm. On one side was her job, her rent, the medicine Arthur needed. On the other was a truth that felt like a physical weight in her chest. If she said nothing, she could pay her bills for another week. If she spoke, she'd be fired by a man who could probably have her blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. She thought of the foreclosure notice. She thought of Arthur's face, pale and confused when he no longer recognized the tools in his own workshop. What was left to lose? A job she hated. Her dignity was already being pawned 1 8-hour shift at a time. She took a breath that felt like it was drawn from the bottom of her lungs. "Excuse me, Mr. Finch." Marcus's head snapped up, his face a mask of irritation. "We're in the middle of something. We'll signal you if we need anything." Alistair Finch didn't look up, his stylus hovering over the approval box on the tablet. "What is it?" I said, "Excuse me," Clara repeated, her voice trembling but finding a core of unexpected strength. "I happened to see the schematic on your screen." Marcus scoffed, a genuine derisive laugh. "Are you kidding me? Beat it." "Your load-bearing columns," Clara said, the words spilling out now, unstoppable. "It's wrong." The stylus in Finch's hand stopped moving. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his head. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they seemed to physically pin her to the floor. "What did you just say to me?" The entire booth was enveloped in a sudden, profound silence. "The revision," Clara said, pointing with a trembling finger toward the tablet. "You're substituting grade 50 steel for grade 65 on the central tower supports. The increased rebar in the concrete doesn't compensate for the loss in tensile strength. Volkov's simulations might say it's fine, but they're not accounting for harmonic resonance under sustained lateral wind loads. You're creating a fatal shear point at the 40th floor. The building won't just fail, it will pancake." Marcus's face had cycled from annoyance to a blotchy, furious red. "How dare you! Mr. Finch, I will have her fired this instant. This is absurd." Clara braced herself for the explosion. She expected shouting, humiliation, the manager rushing over. But Alistair Finch wasn't shouting. He was staring. He stared at the tablet. Then he stared at her. His eyes narrowed, dissecting her. A long, terrifying silence stretched out, thick and heavy. Finally he spoke, his voice dangerously quiet, directed at Marcus. "Is she right?" Marcus sputtered. "Well, sir, she's a waitress. It's a highly complex structural model. It's not... Is she right?" Finch's voice was like grinding steel. Marcus paled, unable to form a coherent answer. He didn't know. He had just presented the data. He had never understood it. Finch turned his glacial gaze back to Clara. She met it, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He pushed his chair back, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent restaurant. He rose to his full, imposing height. He reached into his wallet, pulled out 3 $100 bills, and laid them on the table. He looked at Clara. "What's your name?" "Clara. Clara Evans." "Clara Evans," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and important in his mouth. He looked at her apron, stained with a drop of eau jus, her worn-out shoes, and then back at her fiercely intelligent eyes. "Get your coat. You're coming with me." Clara's mind went blank. "Sir, I have to finish my shift." "Frank!" Alistair Finch's voice boomed, making the manager, who was hovering nervously nearby, jump. "Your waitress just quit." "Hey, she can't just—" Frank started, but Finch was already moving. "Marcus, wait in the car," he commanded. Marcus, looking as if he'd been slapped, scurried away towards the exit. Finch's eyes were locked on Clara. "Your coat." "Now." She was moving before the decision had fully registered. She untied her apron, dropped it on a nearby service station, grabbed her thin jacket from the staff locker room, and walked out of the gilded steer without a backward glance. A sleek, obsidian black Maybach was purring at the curb. Marcus was in the front passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Finch held the back door open for Clara. She slid onto leather that felt like cool silk. The door closed with a soft, definitive thud, sealing her off from the world she knew. The drive was silent and suffocating. Clara could feel Marcus's humiliated glare in the rearview mirror. Alistair Finch simply stared out the window at the city passing by, his city, a muscle in his jaw working rhythmically. Clara looked at her own hands, clasped in her lap. They still smelled faintly of lemon polish and bread rolls. She was wearing a threadbare cardigan in a $500,000 car. It was the most violently surreal moment of her life. They didn't go to an office building. The car descended into a private subterranean garage beneath a towering residential skyscraper on Central Park South and stopped in a spot marked simply Finch. "This way," Finch said, his voice flat. They took a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse. The doors slid open, and Clara forgot how to breathe. The space was a testament to restrained power. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Central Park like a living masterpiece. The furniture was minimal, exquisite, and arranged with geometric precision. "Sit," Finch commanded, gesturing to a severe leather armchair opposite a massive desk made from a single slab of polished granite. Clara sat, her back ramrod straight. Marcus remained by the door, a resentful spectre. Finch rounded the desk and sat. He steepled his fingers, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical pressure. "You're an architect," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No, sir. I dropped out. I was 2 years in. My grandfather got sick." "So you trade in blueprints for menus?" Wasting a mind like that on memorizing who gets the rare and who gets the medium well. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Clara Evans, I'm going to ask you a question. Why would my nephew, my own sister's son, the man I'm grooming to one day take my place, bring me a plan with a fatal flaw and try to pass it off as a cost-saving measure?" Clara's blood ran cold. This was a test far more difficult than the one in the restaurant. He might have just been presenting the data from the engineers, sir. He might not have understood it. I don't pay Volkov Construction $50 million a year to make mistakes that could kill thousands of people and I don't give my nephew a 7-figure salary to be an idiot, Finch said, his voice dangerously low. Try again. Clara glanced at Marcus, who was now visibly sweating. She looked back at Finch. She had already jumped off the cliff. She might as well learn to fly. Honesty was the only currency she had. He wasn't making a mistake, Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. He was trying to get you to approve it. He was counting on you not seeing the flaw, and on your own engineers being too intimidated to question a report from Volkov. And why? Finch pressed. Why would he do that? Clara's mind raced, connecting the dots. The specific change, the specific contractor. Volkov Construction. Who owns it? Or more importantly, who supplies their steel? That substitution, it's not just cheaper, it's a specific grade. Maybe a grade that a certain supplier has a massive, hard-to-move surplus of. If you approve this, someone stands to make a fortune, not just on the cost saving, but on unloading substandard material, Marcus exploded. That's a lie. It's a baseless, insane accusation. Uncle Alistair, you're listening to this nobody over your own family. Shut up, Marcus, Finch said, his eyes never leaving Clara's face. Go on. When I pointed out the flaw, Clara continued, the scene replaying in her mind. He wasn't confused. He was angry. He was cornered. He wasn't trying to protect you from a mistake. He was trying to stop me from exposing a plan. Finch nodded slowly, a grim understanding dawning on his face. He finally turned his attention to his nephew. His voice was no longer loud, but a low, chilling whisper. Marcus. Who is the steel supplier? Marcus stammered, his face ashen. I don't know off the top of my head. It's a complex supply chain. Who is the supplier? It's a subsidiary, Marcus mumbled, defeated. A firm called Apex Materials. A slow, cold, utterly mirthless smile spread across Alistair Finch's face. Apex Materials. I know it. A shell corporation. I also know who owns it. My partner. My best friend of 30 years. Julian Croft. The name hung in the air like poison gas. Julian put you up to this, didn't he? Finch said softly. He and Volkov, skimming off the top. And you, my own nephew. You were the delivery boy. Marcus crumpled, all his bluster gone, replaced by a pathetic, pleading whimper. Uncle Alistair, please. I just did what he told me to do. Get out, Finch said, the two words landing like hammer blows. Your keycard is deactivated. Your accounts will be frozen before you hit the street. Go tell Julian the waitress saw him. Marcus fled, a man whose life had just been demolished. Finch turned back to Clara. The personal anger was gone, replaced by a cold, strategic fury. Congratulations, Miss Evans. You didn't just save a building. You just uncovered the cancer that's been eating my company from the inside out. He stood and walked to the vast window, looking down at the city below. Julian has been my partner since we were laying bricks with our own hands, and he's been robbing me blind. Marcus was just a pawn. This goes deeper than I ever imagined. He turned back to her. I have an offer for you. I'm creating a new department at Finch Holdings. It will have only one employee. You. You will be the head of Project Integrity. You will report directly, and only, to me. You will have veto power over every plan, every contract, every change order. Your job is to be the person who sees what everyone else misses. You will be my eyes. You will be my proof. But I'm a waitress, Clara whispered, the sheer scale of it overwhelming her. I don't even have a degree. You are a waitress, Finch corrected her. You have something better than a degree. You have integrity and a grandfather who taught you how to see. And right now, You're the only person in the world I know I can trust, because Julian and his cronies will never see you coming." He named a starting salary that made Clara's head spin, a number that wasn't just a wage, it was a weapon. It could save her grandfather, their house, their lives, and a signing bonus to handle your immediate financial pressures, he added, with a flicker of understanding. "You start tomorrow." Clara stared at him, this architect of skylines and destinies. It felt like a dream, but the cold knot of fear and exhilaration in her stomach was too real. She thought of the foreclosure notice, of Arthur's vacant stare. She thought of the soaring, beautiful buildings she used to draw. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, Mr. Finch, I'll do it." "Good," he said. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Eleanor, I'm sending someone to your office tomorrow morning. Her name is Clara Evans. Give her anything she wants. She speaks with my voice." The first 48 hours were a disorienting plunge into a new reality. A wire transfer appeared in her bank account, with enough zeros to look like a typo. Clara spent the first hour on the phone, her voice shaking, paying off every one of Arthur's medical bills in full. The relief was so profound, it felt like a physical illness. Then she called the bank holding the foreclosure, her voice now cold and steady, and told them exactly where to send the payoff documents. Her new office was a glass-walled space on the 80th floor, next to the senior engineering division. It was sterile, empty, and had a view that made her feel like she was floating. The whispers followed her down the hall. They saw a waitress in a hastily bought, ill-fitting pantsuit. They saw the woman who had somehow gotten the boss's nephew fired. She was a curiosity, an enigma, a threat. The first person to breach her door was the one Finch had called Eleanor Vance. She was the chief structural engineer for Finch Holdings, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She held 2 rolls of blueprints and an expression of profound skepticism. "So," Eleanor said, forgoing any pleasantries as she spread a blueprint across Clara's empty desk. "You're the one." "I'm Clara Evans," Clara said, standing her ground. "I know who you are. Everyone knows. You're the oracle of the steakhouse." Eleanor tapped the blueprint. "Alistair told me you have final say. So say something. This is the revised plan for the Finch Towers Foundation. What do you see?" It was a test, a public execution, if she failed. Clara looked down at the plan. It was technically perfect, a fortress of concrete and steel designed by Eleanor's own team. She studied it for a long moment, her eyes tracing the lines, seeing the flow of forces. She could find no fault in the design itself, but a waitress doesn't just look at the order. She looks at the whole table. "The design is sound," Clara said. Eleanor's eyebrows went up, surprised. "It's impeccable. But," Clara pointed to a material specification block in the corner. "The rebar is specified as grade A706. The supplier is listed as Global Steel Imports. I've never heard of them." Eleanor's expression hardened. "They came in with a bid 20% lower than our usual supplier. Fully certified. Julian Croft negotiated the deal himself." "There's no such thing as a 20% discount on steel without a catch," Clara said, Arthur's voice in her head again. "Cheap materials are the most expensive mistake you can make." "The certification could be forged. I want an independent spectrographic analysis on their first shipment, and I want to see Global Steel Imports' corporate ownership records." Eleanor stared at her, her skepticism warring with a dawning respect. She had been looking at the math. Clara was looking at the motive. "I'll order the test," Eleanor said, a new tone in her voice, "and I'll get you the corporate records." Clara didn't stop at the steel. She started pulling every active project file, focusing on anything associated with Julian Croft or Volkov Construction. She wasn't an engineer or an executive, so she did what she knew. She was a waitress at the world's most expensive diner, and she was watching her customers. She observed the patterns. Which subcontractors were always used on Julian's projects? Which invoices were consistently approved just slightly over budget? Who signed off on material substitutions? She found a pattern of corruption so deep and pervasive it was staggering. It was a shadow company running alongside Finch Holdings, siphoning off millions through 1,000 tiny cuts. Julian favored a small group of suppliers and contractors, all of whom, after hours of digging through corporate registries and shell companies, she traced back to a single holding firm owned by Julian's son-in-law. They were overcharging for everything from drywall to window caulking, and Julian was approving the inflated costs. The Finch Tower steel was just their most audacious move yet. The report from the independent lab came back a week later. Eleanor Vance walked into Clara's office and placed the thin folder on her desk without a word. Clara opened it. The steel from Global Steel Imports wasn't grade A7206. It was cheap, brittle, recycled scrap, barely fit for making chain-link fences. The certifications were expert forgeries. He was building a time bomb, Eleanor said, her voice a horrified whisper. Alistair's legacy. Julian was going to build it out of garbage. Clara now had the proof. But Julian Croft was not Marcus Thorne. He was Alistair's partner, his friend. A direct accusation from a former waitress, no matter the evidence, could be spun as a conspiracy, a power grab. Julian was powerful, charming, and deeply embedded in the company's structure. She needed to corner him. She needed him to expose himself in a way that couldn't be denied. And she saw her opening. Finch Holdings was in the final bidding stage for the city's new transportation hub, a massive, multi-billion-dollar public works project. It was down to 2 bidders, Finch and a rival consortium, Vanguard Developments. The final bids were due in 1 week. Clara went to Alistair. Julian is going to leak our bid to Vanguard, she said, laying out her logic. It's the biggest project in a decade. If we lose it, our stock will plummet. It would be the perfect moment for him to try and force you out, to trigger a crisis of confidence in your leadership. He'd be ruining himself in the process, Alistair countered, his voice grim. He's arrogant, Clara said. He thinks he's smarter than you. He thinks he can control the fallout, pick up the pieces of the company for pennies on the dollar after the collapse, with Vanguard as his new partner. He's not just stealing from you anymore. He's trying to replace you. Alistair's face was a thundercloud. So what's your plan, Miss Evans? How do you catch a snake without letting him bite you? We let him think he's won, Clara said, a daring, terrifying plan forming in her mind. We prepare 2 bids. One is real, calculated down to the last penny. We keep it completely off the network, on a single air-gapped laptop that only you, me, and Eleanor will have access to. The second bid is a fake. We'll make it look real, but we'll inflate the costs by 15%. We'll make it a strong, but ultimately losing, bid, and we will leak that fake bid to Julian ourselves. Alistair's eyes, which had been clouded with betrayal, slowly cleared, replaced by a cold, predatory light. We let him hand-deliver the poisoned apple to our competition. Vanguard will get our fake numbers, Clara continued, her heart pounding with the audacity of it. They'll confidently submit a bid just under ours, thinking they've got the contract in the bag. They'll bid too high. Then, at the last minute, you will submit our real, lower bid. We win the contract. Vanguard is left looking like fools, and we will have irrefutable proof of the leak, because the only way they could have had those specific, inflated numbers as if they got them from inside this office. The final week was a blur of covert activity. Clara, Alistair, and Eleanor became a silent conspiracy, meeting after hours in a locked office, refining the real bid on their standalone laptop. During the day, they put on a show, working on the fake bid, leaving drafts on servers they knew Julian's allies in the IT department monitored. Clara felt a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. She was no longer just an observer. She was a creator, an architect of a different kind. She was designing a trap, and its engineering had to be perfect. The day before the bids were due, Alistair called a final executive meeting. Julian Croft was there, the picture of a concerned partner, his face etched with fake woe. The silence that followed Julian's shrieking confession was a vacuum, pulling all the heat and life from the boardroom. It was the sterile quiet of a surgical theatre after the final, fatal incision. Julian Croft, the man who had been a titan only moments before, seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit, his face a contorted mask of pure, distilled hatred, his eyes, wild and venomous, locked onto Clara. "You," he spat, the word a projectile. "You think you've won? You're nothing? A stray dog he picked up off the street. When he's done with you, when his conscience is clear, he'll throw you back in the gutter where you belong." Clara met his gaze. The fear she should have felt was absent, burned away by the white-hot certainty of the last few weeks. She felt a strange, cold pity for him. "The difference between us, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room, "is that I know what the gutter feels like. It teaches you to check your foundations before you start to build. You were just trying to tear everything down." There was no more shouting. The security guards, men whose faces were practiced studies in impassivity, took Julian by the arms. He didn't resist. All the fight had drained out of him, leaving a hollow shell. As he was led from the room he had once commanded, his gaze drifted to Alistair, not with anger, but with a look of profound, pleading confusion, as if he genuinely couldn't comprehend how the world he had built for himself had just been unmade. Then the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, and the reign of Julian Croft was over. Alistair Finch stood motionless at the end of the long table. He looked at the empty chair where his partner of 30 years had sat. He looked at the faces of the board members, now a mixture of shock, relief, and craven recalculation, as they mentally shifted their allegiances. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like the sole survivor of a shipwreck, standing on a desolate shore, the ghosts of the drowned still clinging to his clothes. He nodded once, a sharp, dismissive gesture to the board. "This meeting is adjourned." It was a command, not a suggestion. The room emptied in a flurry of whispered conversations and averted eyes. Only Clara and Eleanor Vance remained with Alistair. The silence returned, heavier this time, filled with the wreckage of what had just happened. Alistair walked to the vast window overlooking the city, a city he had built with a man who had tried to ruin him. He rested his forehead against the cool glass. 34 years, he said, his voice a low murmur, meant for the city below, but caught by the two women in the room. We laid the foundations for our first 3-story walk-up with our own hands. We shared a bottle of cheap whiskey and froze our asses off in a rented trailer, drawing up plans on the back of a pizza box. He was my son's godfather. He was the best man at my wedding. He turned from the window, and for the first time, Clara saw the full cost of her discovery. The granite had cracked. The man who annexed rooms with his presence seemed diminished, his shoulders slumped under an invisible crushing weight. This wasn't a victory. It was an amputation. "He called you a stray dog," Alistair said, his eyes finding Clara's. They weren't the eyes of a CEO to his new star employee. They were the eyes of a man searching for a single, solid thing to hold on to in the rubble. He was wrong. You were the canary in the coal mine, and I was too damn blind to see the poison in the air. He took a deep breath, the sound of a man forcing his lungs to work. Eleanor, start the cleanup. I want a full, forensic audit of every project Julian has touched in the last 10 years. No stone unturned, no budget unscrutinized. Burn it down. Burn it all down, and we'll see what's left to rebuild. Eleanor nodded, her expression grim but resolute. And her? She asked, gesturing toward Clara. Alistair's gaze on Clara softened, but the weariness remained. Give her a corner office. Give her a team. Give her whatever she needs. He paused, his focus turning inward. Her title is Executive Vice President, head of a new division. Project Integrity and Strategy. He wasn't just giving her a job. He was carving out a piece of his company and entrusting it to her. He was building a new load-bearing wall where the old one had crumbled. The drive back to the penthouse was a silent, suffocating journey through a city that now looked different to Clara. The towering skyscrapers no longer seemed like symbols of aspiration. They were fragile, vulnerable things, held up by secrets and trust. Alistair stared out the window, his jaw working, and Clara could almost see the ghosts he was seeing in the reflections on the glass. A younger Julian laughing on a steel girder, the two of them arguing over a blueprint, a shared dream that had somehow, curdled into a nightmare. She said nothing. There were no words for this kind of grief. She was the architect of his liberation and the executioner of his oldest friendship. Her new office was on the 88th floor. It was a vast expanse of glass and steel, with a view that stretched from the Statue of Liberty to the Bridges of Queens. It felt less like an office, and more like an observation deck for the gods. For the first week, she felt like an intruder, a ghost in a much nicer uniform. The whispers followed her down the hallways, a constant, rustling static. The waitress, the one who took down Julian Croft, Finch's pet project. She ate lunch at her desk, the silence of her glass cage a strange comfort. She had a team of 3 senior auditors assigned to her, men in their 50s who looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect, waiting for her to make a mistake. The work was not glamorous. It was a painstaking, brutal excavation of a decade's worth of deceit. It was late nights spent tracing payments through a labyrinth of shell corporations, cross-referencing shipping manifests with invoices for materials that were never delivered, and finding the subtle, insidious patterns of Julian's corruption. It was like dismantling a bomb, wire by wire, knowing that one wrong move could bring a new part of the company crashing down. Eleanor Vance became her anchor. The stoic chief engineer would appear in her doorway at 9 p.m., holding 2 cups of stale coffee, and sit with her for hours, helping her understand the technical implications of a falsified concrete stress test or the long-term structural risks of using counterfeit wiring. "Don't let them see you sweat," Eleanor told her one night, gesturing to the auditors outside Clara's glass walls. "You didn't get this job because Alistair likes you. You got it because you see the stress points, not just in the steel, but in the people." Julian's weakness wasn't greed. It was arrogance. He never believed a waitress would look at his math. With her first monumental paycheck, Clara didn't buy a new car or a designer wardrobe. She bought a house, a small, unassuming brick house in a quiet corner of Bayside, with a large garden and an old, solid garage. She moved Arthur in, hiring a gentle, round-the-clock nurse named Rosa to care for him. The first time she walked him through the empty garage, a space she had already mentally filled with the scent of sawdust and wood varnish. He stopped and ran a trembling hand along the thick wooden workbench. "Good grain," he'd murmured, his eyes momentarily clear. Straight. Honest. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She had used his lessons to navigate a world of lies, and the reward was this: a quiet space where he could feel the comfort of an honest piece of wood. It felt more real and more valuable than the view from the 88th floor. On weekends, she didn't go to society galas or rooftop bars. She went to the house in Bayside. She'd sit with Arthur in the garden, telling him about her week in the simplest terms. "We're making sure the buildings are strong, Grandpa. Making sure the lines are straight." Sometimes he would seem to understand, nodding slowly. Other times he would just watch a bird in the branches of the oak tree, a placid smile on his face, lost in a world she couldn't reach. She found a strange peace in these moments. The dizzying complexity of Finch Holdings would fall away, and she was just Arthur's granddaughter again, finding solace in simple, tangible things. And on Tuesday and Thursday nights, after 12-hour days of forensic accounting, she would log into her laptop and attend her online architecture classes at Columbia. The complex equations of structural engineering were a comfort, a language of pure, unassailable logic in a world that had proven to be anything but. She was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding her own abandoned foundation. 6 months bled into a year. The storm at Finch Holdings began to subside. The audits were complete. The cancer of Julian's network excised. Several executives were quietly fired. Contracts were renegotiated. The company, leaner and scarred, was stable. It was built on something new, something harder than ambition, brutal, painful honesty. Alistair was changed. The impatient, formidable titan was gone, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate man. He listened more than he spoke, and his eyes held a permanent shadow of sorrow. He and Clara developed a strange, unspoken partnership. They would meet at the end of the day, not in the boardroom, but in her office, and look over the plans for the day. Their conversations a clipped shorthand of progress reports and strategic questions. He never mentioned Julian's name again. The groundbreaking for the newly redesigned Finch Tower was a major media event. Clara stood in the second row, behind the politicians and board members, feeling the familiar pull of invisibility. It was a role she was surprisingly comfortable with. As Alistair took the podium and spoke of a new era for his company, an era of transparency and unshakable integrity, his eyes briefly found hers in the crowd. It was a fleeting acknowledgement, but it was enough. She wasn't his partner in glory. She was his partner in the trenches, and that bond felt more real than any public accolade. One Saturday afternoon in late autumn, she took Arthur to the construction site. It was quiet, the weekday cacophony of machinery replaced by the whisper of the wind whipping through the skeletal steel frame. The tower was already 30 stories high, a raw skeleton of iron and concrete reaching for the clouds. They stood behind the safety fence, Clara holding her grandfather's arm. He stared up at the immense structure, his head tilted back, his eyes following the clean, soaring lines of the support columns. A deep, guttural sound of appreciation rumbled in his chest. For a long moment, he was silent, the fog in his mind seeming to part. "They're using grade 65, he said, his voice surprisingly clear and strong, the voice of the master carpenter she remembered. Good tensile strength. See how they've braced the core. That's smart. That'll handle the wind shear." He turned to her, and his eyes were truly seeing her, Clara, his apprentice. "The lines are straight, Clara." A slow, proud smile spread across his face. You did good work here. The weight of the past year, the fear, the exhaustion, the crushing loneliness of her position, it all seemed to lift in that single moment. He didn't know the story. He didn't know about the boardrooms or the betrayals or the billions of dollars. He just saw the structure. And he saw that it was true. In his world, that was the only thing that mattered. I learned from the best, Grandpa, she whispered, her throat tight. The project was nearing completion 18 months later. The glass skin had reached the top, and the tower was a shimmering needle against the Manhattan sky. Alistair had summoned her to the top floor. It wasn't finished yet. The floors were raw concrete, and temporary safety lighting cast long, dancing shadows. Wires hung from the unfinished ceiling like metallic vines. The wind howled softly outside the thick panes of glass, a constant reminder of the forces the building was designed to withstand. Alistair was standing at the center of the vast space, not looking out at the panoramic view, but looking down at the floor, at a set of blueprints weighted down with a brick. They were old, faded, the paper yellowed and soft at the edges. "Come look at this," he said, as she approached. She looked down. It was the original plan he and Julian had drawn up for their very first building, the 3-story walk-up. The lines were drawn by hand, the notes scribbled in the margins with 2 distinct sets of handwriting. It felt like an artifact from a lost civilization. "He was the better draftsman," Alistair said, quietly, tracing one of Julian's precise, elegant lines with his finger. "I was always better with the numbers, the logistics. He saw the beauty. I saw the balance sheet. It worked." He looked up from the blueprint, his eyes meeting hers. For a while. He straightened up, turning to face the city spread out below them like a carpet of glittering jewels. "That night at the restaurant," he began. The question she had always known was coming. "You had everything to lose. A life of quiet desperation is still a life. Most people would have held on to it with both hands. Why did you risk it? Not for a building you'd never enter, for people you'd never meet. Why?" Clara thought for a moment. Her old answer, the one about the crooked line, felt incomplete now. She had lived the consequences of that answer, and it had changed her. "Because my grandfather didn't just teach me how to build houses, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice steady against the sound of the wind. "He taught me that what you build is a reflection of who you are. He'd build a simple bookshelf for a neighbor with the same care he'd use on a rich man's staircase, because his name was on it. Not literally, but his integrity was. That blueprint on the tablet. It wasn't just a bad design, it was a lie. It was a building with no integrity. And I realized that a life spent quietly walking past lies, pretending you don't see them, that's no foundation at all. It's just waiting to collapse." Alistair was silent for a long time, watching the endless stream of headlights flowing across the distant bridges. "Integrity," he repeated softly. He finally turned to her, a new light in his eyes, not the predatory gleam of the tycoon or the weary sadness of the betrayed friend, but something new. Respect. "People have been asking me what we're going to name the tower," he said. "They assume Finch Tower. Some of the board, in a fit of sycophancy, suggested the Alistair Finch Legacy Tower." A dry, mirthless smile touched his lips. "Legacy is a funny word. People think it's something you build for yourself. I've learned it's something you leave behind in other people." He didn't offer to put her name on the building. He knew, somehow, that she would have found it vulgar. Instead, he walked her toward the eastern-facing window, which looked out over the sprawling, complex tapestry of Brooklyn and Queens. He pointed toward a vast, derelict stretch of waterfront property, old warehouses and abandoned piers crumbling into the East River. "I just closed the deal on that last week," he said. 200 acres of forgotten land. The city wants a new community. Parks, schools, affordable housing, a place for artists, a tech hub. They want a new model for urban living. They want a foundation for a new generation. He turned to face her fully, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "This tower," he said, gesturing around the raw, empty space. "This was about fixing a broken thing. It was about saving my past. That," he said, pointing back to the dark, waiting waterfront, "is about building a future. And I find I no longer have the blueprints for it." He wasn't asking her to be his eyes anymore. He wasn't promoting her. He was handing her a world to build. "So I'm asking you, Miss Evans," Alistair Finch said, his voice quiet but resonating with the weight of the moment. "As an architect, as a partner, what do we build there?" Clara looked away from him, out at the dark, sleeping expanse of land. She saw not the decay and the ruin, but the potential. She saw the clean lines of community centres, the green spaces for families, the sturdy, honest brick of homes built to last. She saw a place with a foundation of something more than just concrete and steel. The waitress who dreamed of inhabiting the city was gone. In her place stood a woman who was about to build it. A real smile, bright and full of a fierce, earned hope, finally reached her eyes. "I think," she said, "we start with a straight line."